The Dowager Duchess of Ravenscar did not knock before she entered the young Duchess's private sitting room. She had never knocked. Not once in the 8 months since her son Julian had ridden south to fight the French. Leaving behind a bride the Dowager considered a mistake he would eventually correct. Lady Isolde Ravenscar looked up from her writing desk. She was 22 years old, 4 months into her marriage, and 3 months pregnant, though only she and her lady's maid knew the second thing. The Dowager did not sit. "There has been a letter," she said, and her voice carried the awful stillness of a woman who had waited a great deal of time to say a specific sentence. "From the colonel of your husband's regiment." Isolde's hand went to her stomach without her thinking about it. "He fell at Salamanca 3 weeks ago. The letter has been delayed by the packet ships." The Dowager placed a folded document on the desk between them, black wax seal, regimental crest. Isolde stared at it and could not make her hand move to take it up. "There are matters we must discuss," the Dowager continued. "The estate cannot support 2 duchesses. My second son, Lord Cedric, will now inherit the title. His installation will take place at the winter session. You will, of course, need to be gone before then." Isolde looked up. "Gone?" "Julian had no children by you. Under the entailment, a widow without issue has no claim on Ravenscar. You may keep whatever jewels you brought as your dowry. The staff will pack them by tomorrow evening. My carriage will convey you to the Portsmouth Road at first light." "Madam," Isolde's voice was very small, "I am carrying his child." The Dowager Duchess of Ravenscar looked at her daughter-in-law with the mild, faintly irritated expression of a woman being told a piece of information she considered untrue. "No," she said, "you are not." She turned and walked out of the room and closed the door with the same quiet care she had closed every door in that house for 41 years. Isolde sat at the writing desk with her hand on her stomach and the black wax letter in front of her, and she did not open it. She knew, without opening it, what she was going to do. "If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My wife said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that tales like this truly matter." Isolde did not wait for the Dowager's carriage. She left Ravenscar Hall on foot at 3 o'clock in the morning with a leather satchel her lady's maid had packed for her in secret, containing 62 pounds in coin, 3 plain gowns, her mother's pearl earrings, and a small brass-hinged locket her husband had given her on the morning of their wedding. She wore her plainest cloak. She did not take a horse because a horse could be traced. She walked the 6 miles to the coaching inn at Ashford Cross and paid the driver of the northbound mail coach in silver, and she gave a false name. She was Mrs. Vale, she said, a curate's widow, bound for Yorkshire. She was not bound for Yorkshire. 3 days later, in a village called Fell's End on the Cumbrian border, a village so far from London that a woman could disappear inside it, and no one would come looking, Isolde Ravenscar rented a room above a baker's shop and began the work of becoming someone else. She burned the letter from the colonel. She had never opened it. There was a reason she had never opened it. At Ravenscar, the summer she was 17 and Julian was 24, and they were falling in love in a way neither of them had been prepared for. He had told her something she had never forgotten. He had told her that his mother did not want him to marry her, that his mother had a list of 11 other candidates, that his mother had, on 3 separate occasions, produced letters from those candidates and left them on his writing desk in an attempt to redirect his attention. His mother, Julian had said, was very skilled at producing letters. Isolde had thought about that sentence, walking north in the mail coach in the dark. She had thought about it a great deal. The child came in the last week of March, a hard labor, alone in the room above the baker's shop with only the baker's wife, a red-armed Yorkshire woman who had delivered 40 village babies and asked no questions about husbands, to help her. There were 2 of them, twin boys, both healthy, both very small, both, in the candlelight, with the same dark hair Julian had. Isolde named them Thomas and Nathaniel after her grandfathers because she could not bear to give them their father's name and did not know yet whether her father was living or dead. She held them, one in each arm, and she cried without making a sound, and she made a decision. Her sons would not grow up as bastards in a village, but they would also not grow up in a house where their grandmother had tried to erase them before they were born. She would raise them. She would work. She would keep them safe. And if the day ever came when she could prove what the Dowager had done, the forged letter, the false widowhood, the theft of an entire life, She would walk back into Ravenscar Hall with her sons at her sides, and she would take back what belonged to them. Until that day, she would be Mrs. Vale, the seamstress of Fell's End. She hung the locket around Thomas's neck, because he was the elder of the two by 7 minutes, and she told herself that when he was old enough to ask what it was, she would tell him the truth. Fell's End was kind to Mrs. Vale. The village decided, without ever saying so out loud, that a well-spoken young widow arriving with a heavy purse and a heavier grief was not to be pried at. The vicar's wife lent her a Bible and did not ask which parish had married her. The baker's wife taught her how to salt a joint of mutton to last a fortnight. The old lace-maker on the corner of the market square, who had once done piecework for a duchess in Carlisle, taught her a stitch called the running rose that could turn a plain muslin cuff into something a country gentlewoman would pay 4 shillings for. By the time the twins could walk, Mrs. Vale had a modest business. By the time they were 3, she had moved out of the room above the baker's shop into a stone cottage with a thatched roof and a plum tree in the front garden, and she was employing 2 village girls to help with the finer needlework. She dressed her sons plainly, in linen the color of oatmeal, and she cut their hair herself, and she taught them their letters in the evenings by candlelight from a battered primer she had bought from a traveling bookseller. There was one afternoon, in the 3rd year, when she nearly lost everything in the middle of the Fell's End market square. A gentleman she did not recognize at first, a fair-haired man in a well-cut traveling coat, standing at the produce stall opposite hers, looked across at her twice, and then a 3rd time, and then walked slowly across the cobbles toward her stall with an expression she knew very well. She had seen it on the faces of London hostesses when they were trying to place a name. He said, "Forgive me, have we? I am almost certain we have met before. Was it at Lady Wenlock's, perhaps, or at the Countess of Devries' summer party?" Isolde smiled the small, closed smile of a country seamstress being addressed by a gentleman above her station. "No, sir. I have never been to London. My husband was a curate at Kirkby Lonsdale before he died. I have lived in this village these 3 years past." "A curate?" The man's face relaxed slightly, then furrowed again. "You have, forgive me, Mrs. Vale, sir. Mrs. Vale. You have the look, entirely, of a lady I met once at the Wenlock ball. Lady, I cannot recall the name. Not more than 1 season out. Quite young. I have a common face, sir. My mother said so often. Perhaps your lady was my double. Perhaps she was." He bowed. He returned to the produce stall. He did not look at her again. Isolde folded a piece of lace with hands that did not shake, because she had been practicing for 3 years how to make her hands not shake, and she waited until the gentleman was safely gone from the market square before she permitted herself to close her eyes for a moment behind the trestle table. The gentleman had been Lord Wenlock's own younger brother, Colonel Ashwell, who commanded the regiment in which the Duke of Ravenscar had been reported killed. She had sat next to him at supper on the night of her engagement. She did not go to the market square again for 11 weeks. She did not tell them their father was a duke. She did not tell them their father had, so far as she had allowed herself to believe, died at Salamanca in a country she could not point to on a map. She told them their father had been a good man who had loved them very much and had gone away before they were born, and that was as much of the truth as a 5-year-old boy needed to carry. Thomas wore the locket. He wore it inside his shirt, because the village boys teased him for wearing jewelry, and because his mother had told him very gently that it was a private thing. He did not open it. He did not know how to open it. His mother had told him that one day when he was older, she would show him what was inside. Thomas was a serious child. Nathaniel was not. Thomas watched. Nathaniel spoke first and thought afterward. Thomas walked. Nathaniel ran. But they were, in the way that twin children sometimes are, essentially one person split into 2 bodies, and neither of them was ever entirely alone. They both had their father's eyes. Isolde noticed this the first time when Thomas was 4 and turned his head sharply at the sound of a horse in the lane, and she felt the breath go out of her, because it was Julian's exact motion, exactly, and Julian had been dead for 4.5 years. She sat down on the flagstones of the kitchen floor, and she wept for the first time since the boys were born. Then she got up. She washed her face. She rolled her sleeves, and she went back to the linen she had been sewing. The Duke of Ravenscar came home in the spring of the 5th year. He was 31 years old. He had a scar running from his left temple to the corner of his jaw. from a French cavalry saber at Vittoria. He had spent 18 months in a Spanish military hospital, and then 2 years attached to the diplomatic mission at Vienna. Because his letters home had been answered with a silence he had come at last to understand meant something was wrong. The something wrong was not what he had expected. He rode up the long avenue of oaks that led to Ravenscar Hall on a gray afternoon in April, and he saw the black crape still hanging above the great door. Black crape for the late Duke, meaning himself. And he understood, in the moment before he understood anything else, that he had been declared dead. The steward who met him at the door was a man named Harrow, who had been at Ravenscar for 30 years. Harrow looked at the Duke and dropped the silver tray he was carrying and did not apologize. "Your Grace," Harrow said. His voice was not steady. You are meant to be. I know what I am meant to be." The Duke walked past him into the great hall. "Where is my wife?" Harrow did not answer. The Duke stopped walking. He turned around slowly. "Harrow, where is Isolde?" "Your Grace, the Dowager is in the yellow drawing room. She would wish to be the one who—" "Where is my wife?" Harrow looked at the flagstones. "Her Grace the young Duchess," Harrow said quietly, "left Ravenscar 4 years and 11 months ago, the night after the letter from your regiment arrived. She was not, by the Dowager's direction, escorted. She left on foot before dawn. No one has seen her since." The Duke of Ravenscar stood in the great hall of his own house, and he did not move for a long time. "What letter?" he said eventually. "From Colonel Ashwell, your Grace, announcing your death at Salamanca." "I did not die at Salamanca. I was wounded at Vittoria 14 months later." "Yes, your Grace. I now understand." "Who wrote that letter?" Harrow, who had been at Ravenscar for 30 years and had watched the Dowager by a great deal of silence over those 30 years, said nothing. The Duke looked at him. "Harrow, who wrote that letter?" Harrow said, very quietly, "Your mother's second secretary, your Grace, on paper stolen from the regimental stationer in Bath. The seal was pressed with a copy of the regimental die made by a jeweler in Cheapside. I have the jeweler's receipt. I kept it. I did not know what I would ever do with it, but I kept it." The Duke of Ravenscar closed his eyes. Then he opened them and he looked toward the yellow drawing room, and something changed in his face. "My brother Cedric," he said. "Is he in residence?" "He is at his hunting lodge, your Grace. He has been informed of your return. He is not, at present, expected." "No, I would not expect him either." The Duke turned toward the yellow drawing room. Harrow said, "Your Grace, there is one thing more." The Duke stopped. "The morning after her Grace left, the young Duchess, I found something. In her sitting room, underneath the writing desk, it had rolled there. I put it in my strong box, and I have kept it these 5 years." Harrow reached into his coat and produced a small object wrapped in a linen handkerchief. He unwrapped it. It was a pearl earring. The mate to a pearl earring the Duke of Ravenscar had last seen his wife wearing on the night before he had left for Spain. He took it from Harrow's palm. He held it in his own for a moment. Then he walked into the yellow drawing room to see his mother. The Dowager Duchess of Ravenscar was seated by the window with an embroidery frame in her lap when her son entered the yellow drawing room. She looked up. She did not scream. She did not weep. She did not, so far as her son could see, alter her expression in any meaningful way. She said, "Julian, you were reported dead." "I know what I was reported." "By whom, may I ask?" He walked to the window and stood looking down at her. She had aged in 5 years, more than he had expected. Her hair had gone entirely white. Her hands, resting on the embroidery frame, had the faint tremor of a woman past 60. He said, "Harrow has the jeweler's receipt for the false seal." The Dowager Duchess of Ravenscar did not answer at once. She set down the embroidery frame. She said, "I did what was necessary for this family. She was not suitable. She was the daughter of a country baronet with no fortune and no connections. She was going to reduce the Ravenscar title, in 1 generation, to a laughing matter in London. When word came that you had been wounded and were not expected to recover, I did what any woman of my position would have done. I secured the succession. I was not expected to recover. That was the report I received from Cedric's contact at Horse Guards." "Cedric's contact. Your brother has been of a great assistance to me these 5 years, Julian. He has managed the estate. He has represented our interest in London. He has, I believe, done everything you would have wished done, except find my wife." The Dowager Duchess of Ravenscar looked at her son. "There was no wife to find," she said. "There was a young woman who took a great deal of money from this house on the night she left and went, I have every reason to believe, to establish herself under another name in the north. She has not written. She has made no claim. She wishes evidently to be forgotten. I would suggest we honor her wishes." Julian Ravenscar said, "She was carrying my child." The dowager did not blink. "She claimed to be. I did not believe her. I was not required to believe her. You threw a pregnant woman out of my house at 3 o'clock in the morning. I offered her a carriage. She declined it. Because you had told her that her husband was dead. Because she was not, and never was going to be, a duchess." Julian Ravenscar turned away from the window. He walked the length of the yellow drawing room. He stopped at the door. He turned back. "Where would she have gone?" he said. "Think, madam. Where would a woman with 60 pounds and a pregnancy she wished to hide have gone? I have no idea, and I have no interest." "You will have an interest." He left the room. He did not close the door behind him. Harrow was waiting in the corridor. "Your Grace, get me every coaching inn ledger north of London for the second week of October, 5 years ago. The false name will be simple. She would have used something plain, a trade name. Send riders to every inn on the Great North Road within 100 miles. If she boarded a coach, we will find the entry. Yes, Your Grace. And Harrow, Your Grace. Send a rider to my brother's hunting lodge with a written order that he is to remain there until further notice. If he attempts to leave, he is to be brought back. Yes, Your Grace." The Duke of Ravenscar went upstairs to the room that had been his wife's sitting room, and he sat at the writing desk, where the letter had been laid 5 years before, and he put his head in his hands. His mother had been very skilled at producing letters. He had told his wife that, once, years ago. He wondered now if she had remembered, and he did something, sitting at that writing desk, that he had not permitted himself to do in 5 years of Spanish military hospitals and Viennese diplomatic drawing rooms and long gray channel crossings. He counted the letters he had written to her. 14. 14 letters from 4 countries over 4 years to a wife who had not answered a single one. He had told himself for 4 years that the packet ships were unreliable, that the mail from Vienna was routinely intercepted, that his letters had probably been lost at sea or opened by French sympathizers or held at horse guards for reasons of state. He had told himself a great many things. He had not told himself the one thing a better man would have understood on the 3rd unanswered letter, that a wife who does not answer is a wife who has not received, that a wife who has not received is a wife whose household is intercepting the post, that a household intercepting the post is a household that does not wish its mistress to know a certain thing. He should have taken leave in the 2nd year. He should have ridden home in the 3rd year, at the latest unannounced, on his own horse, with no letter sent ahead. He had had every reason to, and he had not, because a diplomatic posting in Vienna was more agreeable than confronting whatever it was he had begun, dimly, in the back of his mind, to fear. He had been comfortable. His wife had been raising his sons, alone, in a village he did not know the name of, on the money she could earn with a needle, because he had been comfortable. The Duke of Ravenscar sat at that writing desk for a long time. Then he rose, and he began to make it right. It took 11 days. The ledger of the Ashford Cross Coaching Inn, dated the 4th of October, 5 years earlier, recorded a Mrs. Vale, a curate's widow, boarding the northbound mail coach for York. The York ledger recorded her transferring to a coach bound for Carlisle. The Carlisle ledger did not record her disembarking, but a driver on that route, when questioned by one of Harrow's riders, remembered a small, well-spoken young woman in a plain cloak who had asked to be set down at a crossroads called Fell's Turn on the Cumbrian border, 3 miles short of the market town. Fell's End was the only village within walking distance of Fell's Turn. The Duke of Ravenscar rode north with 2 men and Harrow, and they arrived at Fell's End on a Tuesday morning in the 2nd week of May. He did not go to the inn. He went to the parish church, and he asked the sexton if a Mrs. Vale, a young widow, lived in the village. The sexton said yes, Mrs. Vale, the seamstress. Cottage on the lane past the plum tree. Very respectable. Twin boys. The Duke of Ravenscar stopped breathing for a moment. He said, "Twin boys." "Yes, sir. Thomas and Nathaniel. About 5 years old now. Handsome lads. The elder one wears a locket." The Duke did not answer at once. Then he said, "Show me the way to the cottage." He walked. He did not take the horse. He walked the lane past the plum tree, and he saw the cottage with the thatched roof, and he saw, in the front garden, 2 small boys in oatmeal linen playing a game with a ball made of stitched leather. One of them turned his head at the sound of the gate. He turned his head with a motion the Duke of Ravenscar had done, unconsciously, every day of his own life. The Duke stopped at the gate. The boy stared at him. The Duke said very quietly, "What is your name?" The boy said, "Thomas Vale, sir." "And your brother?" "Nathaniel Vale, sir." "And your mother?" "Inside, sir. She's finishing a christening gown for the vicar's granddaughter." The Duke of Ravenscar looked at the boy. He looked at the locket, half visible at the boy's collar. He said, "May I speak with her?" Thomas Vale hesitated. He had been told, by his mother, that men who arrived at the cottage were sometimes cloth merchants and sometimes tax collectors, and were not, in either case, allowed inside without her being warned first. He said, "Wait here, sir, please." He ran into the cottage. The Duke of Ravenscar waited at the gate. He heard, from inside the cottage, a woman's voice saying something to the boy in a calm domestic tone. Then a silence. Then the sound of a chair being pushed back. Then his wife came to the door. She was thinner than he remembered. Her hair, which had been almost auburn when she was 22, was darker now. She wore a plain gray gown and a linen apron, and her sleeves were rolled to the elbow because she had been sewing, and she was holding a needle in her right hand as though she had forgotten she was holding it. She looked at him. She did not scream. She did not weep. She did not move. She said, "You are meant to be dead." He said, "I know. I have been told." She looked at Thomas, who was standing very close to her skirts. She looked back at him. She said, "How did you find us?" He said, "Isolde, may I come inside?" She said, "No." She said it gently. She said it as a woman gives an answer she has practiced in her head, in the dark, for 5 years. She said, "You cannot come inside, Julian. Not yet. You must tell me first. You must tell me who else knows that you are here." They sat on the low stone wall at the bottom of the garden, at Isolde's insistence, where the boys could see her from the front door, but could not hear what she was saying. The Duke told her, in short sentences, what had happened. The wound at Vittoria, the Spanish hospital, the Vienna posting, the letters that had received no answers, the homecoming, Harrow, the pearl earring, his mother. Isolde listened without interrupting. When he was finished, she said, "She threw me out because I was carrying your child, not in spite of it. Yes. She wanted Cedric to inherit. Yes. And Cedric knew." The Duke did not answer at once. He said, "I believe he did. I have not yet confirmed it. He is at his hunting lodge under my order not to leave. When we return, I will confront him." "When we return?" Isolde looked at him. "Julian, I cannot return." He said, "Isolde, listen to me." Her voice was very steady. "Your mother has been the mistress of Ravenscar Hall for 41 years. She has told every servant, every tenant, every peer of your family in every drawing room in London that I abandoned you on your deathbed and vanished with your household silver. That is the story that has been told for 5 years. If I return to Ravenscar as your wife, and these 2 boys return with me as your heirs, do you understand what will happen? You will be my wife. They will be my sons. They will be called bastards, Julian. Every drawing room in London will say I was pregnant by another man when I fled. Your mother will produce witnesses. She will produce letters. She is skilled at producing letters. My sons will be legally your heirs and socially unmentionable for the rest of their lives, and Cedric will contest the inheritance in the courts for the next 30 years, and Thomas will grow up in that courtroom instead of in a house." The Duke of Ravenscar was quiet for a long time. He said, "Then what do you want?" Isolde looked at him. She said, "I want it done publicly. I want it done in one night, in front of every peer she has lied to, in a room where she cannot leave and cannot deny. I want the forged letter in evidence. I want Harrow's jeweler's receipt. I want Cedric present. and I want the proof of the boy's paternity produced in front of the room in a way that no drawing room in England will be able to whisper against." The Duke of Ravenscar said, "The christening feast at Ravenscar, midsummer. Every peer of the northern counties will be present. My mother will have arranged it herself for Cedric's daughter." "Yes," Isolde said, "that one. You would return for that." "I would return for that, not before. And the proof of paternity." Isolde reached inside the collar of her gray gown. She drew out a small key on a plain iron chain. She said, "The locket Thomas wears was given to me on our wedding morning. You told me, when you gave it to me, that it contained a lock of your hair and a folded miniature of your own mother's ring. There is one other thing you told me. You said the lock of hair had been cut by your father's own valet on the morning of your christening, 31 years ago, and dated in the valet's hand. There is no man alive, Julian, who could have replicated that document, not even your mother." The Duke of Ravenscar stared at his wife. He said, "You have never opened it." Isolde said, "No. I have carried the key inside my collar for 5 years, and I have never opened it, because I knew, in the room above the baker's shop the night the boys were born, that if I ever needed to prove they were yours, I would need proof no drawing room in London could dismiss, and I knew, Julian, that one day I would need it." The Duke of Ravenscar sat on the low stone wall in the garden of a cottage in Fell's End, and he looked at his wife and he understood, for the first time, exactly what kind of woman he had married. He said, "Midsummer." She said, "Midsummer." The christening feast at Ravenscar Hall on Midsummer Eve was attended by 94 persons, including 7 peers of the realm, 3 bishops, and the entire senior clergy of the northern dioceses. The Dowager Duchess of Ravenscar, in half mourning for her elder son and full satisfaction at her younger son's daughter, presided at the head of the long table beneath the portrait of her late husband. Cedric sat at her right hand, sullen, having been permitted to leave his hunting lodge for the ceremony under his brother's direct order and his brother's direct watch. Julian Ravenscar sat at the foot of the table in the seat that had been kept for 5 years, ceremonially empty in his supposed honor. At the end of the second course, before the toasting had begun, the Duke of Ravenscar rose from his seat. The room went quiet. He said, "I have an announcement to make. Before it is made, I will ask my brother Cedric to remain in his seat. If he attempts to leave, my steward, Mr. Harrow, who is at the door, has instructions to prevent him." The dowager set down her wine-glass. The Duke said, "5 years ago, when I was believed dead at Salamanca, my wife, the Duchess of Ravenscar, was told by my mother that I had fallen. She was told this on the basis of a letter that had been forged on stolen regimental stationery using a false seal that was cut for the purpose by a jeweler in Cheapside. Mr. Harrow has the jeweler's receipt. Mr. Harrow, please produce it." Harrow, at the door, walked the length of the room and laid a folded receipt in front of the Bishop of Carlisle. The Bishop of Carlisle opened it. He read it. He looked up. He did not speak. The Duke of Ravenscar continued, "On the strength of that letter, my mother expelled my wife from this house in the middle of the night. She did so knowing that my wife was carrying my child. My mother has spent 5 years telling every peer of the northern counties and every drawing room in London that my wife abandoned me on my deathbed and vanished with the household silver. That is not what happened. What happened was that my mother wished my brother Cedric to inherit the title, and my wife stood in the way of that." The Dowager Duchess of Ravenscar rose to her feet. "Julian, sit down, madam." She sat down. At the far end of the table, Lord Cedric Ravenscar rose from his own chair. He did not speak. He did not look at his brother. He looked once toward the great doors at the end of the hall. Harrow, at those doors, did not move. But he raised his chin very slightly, and Cedric, who had known Harrow since he was a boy of 6, understood exactly what that motion meant. Cedric sat down. He put his glass carefully back on the table. He did not look up again. The Duke said, "My wife is alive. She has been living under a false name in a village in the Cumbrian border for 5 years. She has been supporting herself and my 2 sons, my twin sons, born 4 months after she was thrown from this house, by her own labor as a seamstress." 94 persons in the great hall of Ravenscar did not move. The Duke said, "There will be, in every drawing room in London, doubt raised about the paternity of these boys. My mother will raise it. My brother Cedric, whose inheritance they displace, will raise it. I will therefore settle it now. in this room, in front of the 3 bishops and 7 peers of the realm present, so that it may never be raised again." He turned toward the great doors at the end of the hall. He said, "Isolde, bring the boys in." The doors opened. The Duchess of Ravenscar walked the length of the great hall in a plain gray gown, with a small brass-hinged locket in her right hand, and a twin boy on either side of her, both of them in oatmeal linen, both of them with their father's dark hair, both of them turning their heads at the sound of a chair scraping with the exact motion the Duke of Ravenscar had done, unconsciously, every day of his own life. She stopped at the foot of the table. She placed the locket in front of the Bishop of Carlisle. She said, "This was given to me on my wedding morning. It contains, according to my husband, a lock of his hair cut by his father's valet on the morning of his christening 31 years ago, and dated in the valet's hand. I have never opened it. I would ask your grace to open it now, in front of this company, and to read what is inside." The Bishop of Carlisle took the locket. He fitted the small key into it. He turned it. The locket opened. He drew out a folded slip of parchment. He unfolded it. He read the inscription in the valet's hand, dated the 3rd of April of the year the Duke had been born. He held up the lock of dark hair, which was undeniably the same dark hair the 2 small boys standing in front of him were carrying. The Bishop of Carlisle looked at the Dowager Duchess of Ravenscar. Then he looked at the Duke. He said, "Your Grace, there is no question. These are your sons." The Dowager Duchess of Ravenscar sat at the head of her own table in front of 94 witnesses, and she did not move and she did not speak, and every person in that room understood at the same moment that her 41-year mistressship of Ravenscar Hall had ended in a single sentence spoken by a bishop over a folded piece of parchment. Cedric put his head in his hands. Julian Ravenscar walked the length of the great hall. He knelt down in front of his 2 sons, not in front of his wife, but in front of the boys, and he said something to them that no one else in the room could hear. Thomas Vale, aged 5, looked at the man in front of him and said in his serious voice, "Are you my father, sir?" The Duke of Ravenscar said, "I am, Thomas. I am very sorry I am late." Thomas Vale considered this for a moment. Then he said, "It's all right, sir. Mother told us you would come one day. She was right." Ravenscar Hall was quiet in the days that followed. The dowager withdrew to the dower house on the far side of the estate, where she remained in near total silence for the 11 years that were left of her life. Cedric returned to his hunting lodge and did not attend another season in London. Harrow was made comptroller of the household, at double his previous salary, and kept the jeweler's receipt in a locked drawer in his own desk, where it remained until his death. Thomas and Nathaniel Ravenscar grew up in a house that had been waiting for them for 5 years without knowing it. They were taught to ride by the same groom who had taught their father. They were taught their letters by the same tutor. Thomas kept the locket. He wore it inside his shirt for the rest of his life, because his mother had told him once, on a Tuesday morning in the garden of a cottage in Fell's End, that it had brought his father home. And Isolde Ravenscar, who had walked 6 miles in the dark at the age of 22, carrying 62 pounds and a secret, took her place at the foot of the long table in the great hall, and never again, in the 39 years of her life that remained, allowed a letter into that house without opening it herself.